Hello and welcome to my research presentation, The Integrated Soundtrack, Blurring the Line Between Sound Design and Score in Film and TV Soundtracks. My name's Archie Lamont and I'm currently studying for a Masters in Electronic Music Composition at the University of West London. The integrated soundtrack is defined by Kulizik-Wilson as a disregard for traditional soundtrack hierarchy and an interest in an integrated approach that recognises the interconnectedness of all soundtrack elements, dialogue, music and sound effects. In my own experience as a composer and sound designer working on moving image and audiovisual projects, I found that integrating sound design elements, sound effects, dialogue, foley and ambient sound with music composition to be an approach that results in a more cohesive end product. I've also observed that in many contemporary soundtracks, it is often difficult to distinguish sound design from score, for example in productions such as Under the Skin and Chernobyl. My experience and observations prompted me to consider what impact the professional techniques and approaches adopted in the creation of these integrated soundtracks were having on the evolution of the art form. The goal for this preliminary research is to develop a deeper understanding of the processes involved in soundtrack construction, how the various disciplines feed into each other, the different conceptual and production methods used to blur the line between sound design and score, and the role of this integrated approach in the advancement of film sound. It was important to explore previous academic literature that not only detailed the theoretical and conceptual underpinnings of integrated soundtrack approaches, but also examined the experiences, techniques, and philosophies of established practitioners, both in sound design and film composition, who have blurred this line in the past. Some of the scholars that helped inform my own ideas in this area include Cassanellas, Shion, Barnes, Green, and Kulizik-Wilson. I also explored literature on the work of innovative sound designers like Walter Murch, Alan Splett, Randy Thom, and Johnny Byrne, reflecting on their emotive musical approaches to sound design. In addition, the texture-focused sound worlds created by contemporary composers pushing the boundaries of film scores were also studied, such as Mika Levy, Hildur Gudnadóttir, and Jóhann Jóhannsson. The book Sound Design as a New Score by Daniela Kulizik-Wilson proved to be particularly helpful in the construction of this preliminary study. The author explores the theoretical, aesthetic, and sensuous dimensions of the trend that she believes is substituting traditional Hollywood scoring and mixing practices with a more adventurous language and methods that recognize the interconnectedness of all soundtrack elements. This, she asserts, has led to the production of soundtracks in which it is difficult to tell the difference between score and ambient sound, where pieces of pre-existing musique concrète or electroacoustic music are merged with diegetic sound, sound effects are absorbed by the score or treated as music and diegetic sound is treated as musique concrète. The Palgrave Handbook of Sound Design and Music in Screen Media Integrated Soundtracks, edited by Kulizik-Wilson and Green, is made up of a range of scholarly essays and in-depth interviews with sound recordists, sound designers, composers, orchestrators, and music supervisors. Cassanellas, whose research is focused on exploring how new technologies interact with music and film, details in his article Mixing as a Hyper-Orchestration Tool. Music for contemporary film and television has drastically changed with the incorporation of computer-aided technology, which has greatly expanded the possibilities afforded to composers. In a separate interview with sound designer Johnny Byrne, he details some of the techniques used to create musicality and the diegetic sound of Under the Skin. A lot of things would appear to have tone in them because I've EQ'd at very specific musical frequencies, like when she drives through the football fans. Very tight EQs give a musical effect. Walter Murch's groundbreaking work on the soundtrack for Apocalypse Now led him to coin the term sound designer, describing the role as someone who plans, creates the sound effects, and mixes the final soundtrack, and thereby takes responsibility for the sound of a film, the way the director of photography takes responsibility of the image. He describes using diegetic sound as emotive musical cues to develop the story in Apocalypse Now. What you hear under the dialogue is this turbine whine accelerating. Musically, it gives you a sense of anticipation and a wind-up. Something's about to happen. He also talks of his early experiments of integrating sound design and score. The sound of the outboard motor in Godfather 2 was tuned to harmonise with the music that Nino Rota wrote. We tuned the engine, but in those days we did it by speed varying the tape recorder. Alan Splett is another influential sound designer that's brought a symbiotic musicality to the soundtrack. This is most evident in his dual role of sound designer and music editor, typically distinct roles, on Philip Kaufman's The Unbearable Lightness of Being, which Green states led to an interesting collaboration where sound and music were conceived together early in the production process. Green also notes that in this hybrid role, Splett creates a vibrant soundtrack through careful editing of Janicek's compositions and weaves his sound design through this music to enhance the sense of place, narrative, and character. Kirst, a composer and professor for music technology and composition at the University of Southern California, observes that contemporary composers pushing the boundaries of the art form look for sound that represent the story, the character, a location. He believes the tradition that comes from a pitch-oriented score has been replaced by a sound-oriented world. Sound is not just a carrier of pitch anymore, it has its own character and personality. Under the Skin composer Mica Levi believes the blurred line between sound design and score may be down to listening habits developing outside of the cinema. The sound design, music atmospheres, almost even just trailer effects, that often occurs in films is much more present in music that people are actually listening to at home. Will Ward, a composer and sound designer working predominantly in the advertising industry, describes his hybrid approach in an interview with LBB Online. For me, writing music is the same as creating sound design. It's simply a case of building sounds in layers and blocks, composing the right amount of texture and colour to fill a space in a considered way. Hildur Guðnadóttir's score for the HBO miniseries Chernobyl is a great example of a composer seeking not only musical inspiration, but raw sonic material from the environment in which the story is set. In an interview on Score at the podcast, she details the process, saying, "They filmed most of the series in Lithuania in a power plant that's been decommissioned. Right before they went to shoot, I went there to record. We worked to score from these recordings, so every single sound is made from those power plant recordings." The big solo musician of the score was this door, which made this incredible sound. It was a door to a pump room. So I'd just take those little snippets and they would become the melodic aspects of the score. For my preliminary study, I chose to adopt a qualitative research methodology in the form of both structured and semi-structured interviews with film sound practitioners. This interview-based approach was chosen to use conversation as a learning tool, listening to industry professionals' opinions and first-hand experiences of blurring the line between sound design and score in their field. This approach would also help inform the design decisions and methods for my larger project, as well as act as a useful networking tool. 4 interviews were carried out in total, 2 structured asynchronously via email, and 2 semi-structured synchronously via Zoom. Synchronous interviews allow for an immediate and dynamic form of dialogue, and can encourage spontaneous interactions between participants and researcher. Asynchronous interviews aren't as interactive, but allow participants to work around their personal or work-based schedules and take the time to consider and reflect on the questions and their answers, thus enriching the interview text. 4 participants were selected from different roles within the industry to gather a varied range of experiences and opinions, including a sound effects editor, a composer, sound designer composer, and a director-writer. The question topics were influenced by the initial research of previous academic literature, particularly the work of Kolesic Wilson and Green, and my own experiences as a composer and sound designer. The main topics covered were views on addressing sound design and score at the start of the production process, their experience of collaboration between roles, disciplines, in soundtrack creation, how sound design influences their compositional process and vice versa, their use of less conventional musical devices to underscore narrative and underlying messages in their work, the opportunity in the industry to explore interaction between image story and sound, their views on soundtrack hierarchy and the idea of an integrated soundtrack, and their opinions on the advancement of digital technology and blurring the line between sound design and score. The phrasing of each question was tailored to suit each interviewee, and their specific role within the industry. The first semi-structured interview via Zoom was with sound effects editor and sound designer Darren Banks, who has worked on Killing Eve, The Day Shall Come, Four Lions, and The Irregulars. This is what he had to say when I asked for his definition of the role of a sound designer.
It depends on like what kind of job you're on. I mean, if it was like an animation job and you were literally constructing every single sound that's going on, sound designer, definitely. If you're on a drama that is very kind of, straight, so it's, it's atmospheres, it's cars, it's doors, it's just ambiences, nothing funky, there's no slow-mo, there's no dream sequences, there's no flashbacks, then that for me is a sound effects editing job, because you're editing, you're not constructing some strange world or doing any kind of set pieces. But then you get jobs that are kind of, again, it goes back to this blurry line, that are kind of half and half.
He then described his experience of working alongside and collaborating with the composer for the TV series The Irregulars.
I was sending sort of work in progress stuff that I was doing over to the composer, so he could see where I'm filling all the frequencies available and hit points and stuff, because I was doing a lot of, risers and whooshes and big stingers and impacts. So it kind of, we could both see where each other was kind of, heading. So if he kind of, was doing a big rise up in score and then doing a big hit or a big impact orchestral thing, I could either sort of leave that space for him, or I could embellish it, add to it. So it was nice to kind of be able to do that, because it doesn't usually happen, to be fair, having that direct input with the composer and then getting some feedback,
The second semi-structured interview through Zoom was with film and TV composer Adrian Corker, whose previous work includes Tin Star, Waiting for You, and The Have-Nots. He spoke about the process of using field recordings captured at specific locations in Liverpool where Tin Star was filmed in the score.
They just reused little bits where they work dramatically. I mean, maybe the recordings using the contact mics on the bridge, were quite good. Were used in a few places. Like I said, there was certain string motifs that are like replayed in spaces and recorded that we used. Some horn stuff, some percussion stuff. I mean, I think there's more in than I remember, actually.
He then reflected on the difficulties of realising this creative vision on a big budget TV series like Tin Star.
Sound is just not really, it's the last thing, so when you try and move it forward in the creative process, which you have to do if you're going to do something really different, just people's minds are elsewhere. So you've got to do a lot more work before you do that. You've got to have conversations with script editors and creative people. And, it's got to be a holistic part if you're going to start taking, I mean, in that case, was recording, spaces within Liverpool, and didn't know quite how it was going to end up in the score. So that, so in the end, I only used little bits of it in the score.
He also talked about the process of finding and isolating rhythmic parts in field recordings to use in his music.
I mean, I've been working on another track actually using field recordings, which is using field recordings to find almost rhythmic elements within the field recording and then edit them into rhythmic parts that are almost kind of loops. But the rhythmic parts, because there might be there's like a kind of bass frequency appears in the middle of a field recording, and you can sort of just create, regular, but the kind of sort of semi-irregular. But so if the loops, they'd be quite long, and they wouldn't always be the same loop every time. But roughly, there's a sense of some sort of repetition. Because it's again like that idea that you get a rhythm track from something that isn't inherently rhythmic if you just sat and listened to it. I kind of like those sorts of processes, and I think I maybe did a bit of that. Started doing a bit of that on Tin Star.
Through a structured interview via email, I spoke with composer and sound designer Antoine Bocarica, who has worked across different media sectors on commercial projects for Nike, video game sound design for Serenity at Dusk, and composition and sound design for the short film Hold Me Tight. He talked about taking a cohesive, texture-focused approach to the soundtracks, stating that he tends to create both at the same time, as he likes to apprehend the sound as a small world. Everything needs to be coherent to build something soundly interesting and create a deep dialogue between the different assets. At least there has to be one link between everything: tonality, rhythm, spatialization, textures. He uses a similar sound effect tuning technique touched upon earlier by Walter Murch, harmonizing certain diegetic sounds like car or bird sounds with his music. He adds that even if these changes may be subtle, our brain catches it without even noticing, creating a sense of coherence. And if you play with that, you can, on the contrary, create tension by applying atonal movement. He touches upon his ideal collaborative process, saying that, "I love working with directors because most of the time you can have deep conceptual conversations about the place sound should have in the movie. You explore sounds like an idea, a concept, before experimenting with raw materials." And on the advancement of digital technology and blurring the line between sound design and score, he says, "In linear audio, I can handle almost everything in 2 or 3 separate projects. One for music composition, another one for mixing and mastering, and the last one for additional sound design, foley, and dialogues. The dialogue between all the different parts of the soundtrack is permanent and easier to make coherent." Writer and director Ben Sharrock, who has directed the feature films Limbo and Picadero, also agreed to answer some questions through email. It was useful to hear his experiences and views as someone who essentially makes the final creative decisions as a director. He says that he begins to think about the role of sound as early as the writing stage, as he feels sound and score and how they correspond with each other and the visuals is integral to telling the story and can sometimes be more instrumental than the visuals. He details some examples of this in his own work. In Limbo, the score is split into elements that relate to Omar's character, his family, and the island itself. The score and sound design shape the character of the island almost as much as the visuals do, and the dissonant, out-of-tune oud sound in the bedroom scenes speak to Omar's out-of-tune struggles with his identity. He also notes that in Picadero, every interior scene in the cramped family apartment is underscored with a washing machine whirring in the background. This is an element of the mum's character, but it also relates to Gorka's psyche, the feeling that he's stuck on a spin cycle. Sharrock feels that in his own experience, there is not enough importance given to exploring and experimenting with the interaction between image, story, and sound. He elaborated by saying, "Moving into my next film, I want to work to a different method where there is more crossover between the picture editing and sound editing in the early stages of post-production. Traditionally, you would lock picture and then move on to sound design. This is driven by economics rather than creativity, and I would like to challenge this model on future projects." When analysing the results of the study, I noticed the following trends, some in line with the previous academic literature detailed earlier. An emphasis on collaborative process, importance of considering the interaction between sound, score, and story at the very start of the filmmaking process, a texture-focused approach to the soundtrack, sonic coherence between sound design elements and score, use of sound material from the story environment in the music composition process, use of diegetic sound as emotive, musical, and narrative cues, and the opportunity to explore the crossover between picture edit and sound edit. These results have influenced the design of my larger project in the following ways. They have generated ideas for and informed the conceptual approaches to the practical pieces I will be creating. They've provided clarity on the production techniques and methods that I will utilise. They've opened my mind to aspects of collaboration within the soundtrack. In addition, this research has broadened my understanding of industry roles in film sound and given me a clearer idea about how they interact with each other in a professional setting. It has also widened my network of contacts in the industry, with a few of the participants even agreeing to provide sound effects if needed and give feedback on the practical work as it develops. For the major project, I will adopt a mixed methods approach, combining both qualitative and practice research methods. The goal of this project is to produce several moving image pieces that showcase the benefits of an integrated soundtrack. and how making sound a holistic part of the story early on in the production process can produce a richer viewing experience. For this, I'd like to work in conjunction with a filmmaker to explore this concept and the different methods involved to produce 3 pieces. A naturalistic piece that uses solely diegetic ambient sound effects from within the scene to tell the story through sound. Another that utilises solely field recordings from the story environment and electroacoustic techniques in the construction of the score. And a third that showcases a clear rhythmic, melodic, and harmonic coherence between sound design score and the image. Further semi-structured interviews are also planned with industry practitioners to increase the depth of research and aid in the development of the practical work. In terms of the wider impact of this research, it seems that a new generation of filmmakers are taking a more homogeneous approach to sound and image, exploring the relationship between the soundtrack and story early on in the production process. This is backed up by sound designer and composer Nicholas Becker, who says, "In their mind, it's more balanced. People now call me before the DOP. It never happened before." This could lead to considerably more experimentation with sound design score and visuals, breaking old hierarchies in favour of a more integrated approach to sound as a whole. In addition, with the interchanging of disciplines and roles within the sound post-production industry, this trend could play a vital role in the evolution of the soundtrack.